Friends, either you've got a real problem and you're closing your eyes to the realities of the world because there's a situation going on that you do not wish to acknowledge. Or are you not aware of the caliber of disaster indicated by the declining achievement of our children today? Well, you got trouble, my friends. You got trouble. And I say trouble right here in River City. You see, you got to find a way to help to keep the young ones achieving in school. Trouble, 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 trouble. Yes, we got trouble right here in River City. And that starts with T, and that rhymes with, that's trouble, the capital T. And that rhymes with test. That starts with test, that rhymes with best, and that's the way to get out of this trouble. Testing is the solution to our problems in helping our students achieve. With apologies to the music man, I want to talk a bit about what I call the measure man, but what I really call the measure of man. And the reason I chose the music man as sort of a start for it is, I don't know if you know the story of the music man, but it's basically about a con artist who comes in, he tries to con the city about that and get music. Now, I don't consider myself to be a con artist, but I do have an interesting story to tell, and that is when I first got interested in testing and schooling and becoming a teacher, I was really quite concerned because at the time, they had introduced a new testing program in British Columbia, and all of a sudden, all the graduating students would have to write exams. And as part of those exams, it was 40% of their grade. And I said, well, this can't be a good solution to the problem, right? They want accountability. They wanted to have some sort of common measure of achievement. And I said, this is just a disaster. How is this going to help? So one of my professors at the time said, Don, just take your time to learn a bit about this. And so I started to read about it. And just like the music man in the story that he falls in love, I kind of fell in love with testing. So I know, you all laugh at that. But it's true. I mean, for me, it is a real passion. And that's what I really want to start to talk about. And this is what I'm going to talk about, is my journey today that led me, and hopefully all of you, to start to love testing as well. So when I speak and when I talk, I like to use analogies and metaphors. Now, that sometimes is confusing for people because I'm a quantitative researcher and they don't think we can work with metaphors and analogies. So we'll see how we do here. I will argue that tests are like rocks. Now, how many of you have seen a rock before? Okay, so for those of you that didn't put your hands up, those are the little round things on the ground. So we have several of them. So how many of you have ever written a test? Probably most of you, just like the rocks. So you can see the similarity between the two, right there. But I can make it even stronger than that. How many of you have ever been hurt by a rock? Right? Felt the pain of a rock? Right? You can all remember. How many of you have ever felt the pain of a test? Now you're seeing how they connect so well, right? So it's much more than an analogy. All right, so all kidding aside, what I talk about with tests is we've all experienced them, but we've never thought deeply about them. And it's the same with rocks. As you look at rocks, from the distance, they look quite plain, normal. They're very it's a rock, let's be honest. But as you start to get closer and look more closely at the rocks, you see there's actually quite a bit of complexity underneath that surface of the rock. And that's exactly the same with tests. Once I start to look at tests a little more closely, I start to appreciate just how the complexity of testing and some of the real amazing things that we've done with testing over the years, what we can do with them, potential of them, but also some of the real pitfalls that we get into. So that's what I'm going to talk to you about today, is two aspects of my research. One is looking at large-scale testing, and the other is looking at more classroom testing and some of my work on that. So just to give you a sense, how many test questions do we need on a test? Now, let me give you a bit of the science that's come up on testing. We can actually measure stuff. Let's appreciate. I mean, I've got a ruler here. I can measure height quite simply. Measuring what you're thinking right now is more complex. Measuring your attitudes, measuring your abilities in math, that's more complex. But is it? We actually have the tools right now to develop tests that for every question you answer, depending on the answer you give, I can have a computer choose, I can choose the next question to give. The test will adapt to you as you respond to it. And what that will let me do is very quickly get to your ability or what you're thinking. Now, to give you a sense, you've all done this game before, 20 questions. That's the exact same kind of thing that we can do with testing. We can use a series of questions and adapt them to your responses to get to specifically what you're thinking, or in this case, your ability in math or in reading, right? The new theory on this is called modern test score theory because it was developed in 1960. Right? We're slow in the measurement field to adapt. But in fact, when modern test score theory came out in 1960, there was not a computer on the planet that could run it. It was that the mathematics was so complex. Today, that computer right there does it in about 3 seconds. It can take a full set of data for a whole country of testing and give you all the data in 3 seconds. So that's the changes just in computing power. But that modern test score theory, or what we now call item response theory, allows us to develop large-scale tests that can really focus in on abilities, on your structures, in terms of what you're thinking, your attitudes, and get really good sense of how good you are in whatever thing we're trying to measure, i.e. math, reading, usually academic achievement type things. Now, any of you have written any tests like the GRE or the MCATs, the IELTS, TOEFL, all these large-scale tests, they're all IRT-based, item response-based tests, every one of them. They have a lot of power. Again, we can adapt them for each person. We typically don't do that because of political issues. It's not fair for one person to only have to write 20 items, another person to have to write 50 items. So people get a little nervous about that. So we've often had to change the system just to deal with the politics of testing, which of course is another part of my research, is what happens when we deal with these kinds of things. So that gives you one sense. Now, another thing I've done a lot of work in is the whole area of large-scale testing. And this is what got me started, is I was looking at how to make tests shorter, because I don't like them to begin with. So I was trying to do that. I don't like marking them either. That's another story. But one of the things I got into was this whole notion of what can we gain from tests. And so one of my first big studies was looking at what I would call predictors of achievement. And we looked at school factors and student factors and teacher factors that seemed to make a difference in the achievement of children. So a good example of this is a study one of my first studies I've done. It's still one of my most cited studies. I think time's a benefit on this one. But basically, what we found was that the vast majority of the difference is not due to teachers. I hate to say this. It's not due to schools. It's due to the background of children. What they come to a school or come to a classroom environment has a big impact on their achievement on any kind of test. Their socioeconomic status matters, number of books in the home, all the kinds of things we think of, language background, things like that. But there are other things that do matter. So at the teacher level, we seem to have found some evidence that teachers who teach mathematics in the morning seem to result in higher achievement in math. We know that the gender of a teacher can matter. We've seen some evidence of that for certain subject areas. Subject area knowledge seems to have some impact. Not as much as we'd like sometimes, but it's definitely there. Other things at the school matter. So for example, schools, larger school or smaller school, right? It seems that larger schools seem to result in higher achievement. Now, what that causes is a whole different story, because it could simply be a matter of where they're located, because we've also seen evidence that being in suburban locations seems to be there. Now you're getting to socioeconomic status as well. So these are all complex things that we get the base measure, but what it means after that is much harder. Another one that seems to matter on this is the climate of the school. And what I mean by that is how much the school cares about students. The number one predictor at a school level is what we call the discipline climate. Do children think the school is a fair place? Are the teachers fair? Are the principals seen as being fair? Am I treated with respect as a student? Those schools seem to have higher achievement results than schools that don't have the same kind of measures. So we've done a lot of work around achievement. We've also done some work on what I would call health outcomes. And this is a more interesting one because we can't seem to find any school level factors that matter there. There's a small amount, but it doesn't seem to matter. We've also noticed a lot of differences across different countries. So for example, does anybody here, and I talked about this before, do you know where the best schools are in the world for children? You probably won't believe the answer. United States of America. Do you want to know where some of the worst schools are in the world for children? Right? We talk about the U.S. as having a slope like this, right? The school your child goes to matters a lot. The country I come from, which you may have picked up on, is Canada, and our slope's like this. Actually doesn't really matter which school your child goes to in terms of the quality of education that they'll receive. We're much more equitable in our outcomes for children. It doesn't mean there aren't differences, but the school level differences are much less. New Zealand, I don't know the data on yet. I'm still trying to find that one, but I suspect you're somewhere there. So again, this is a policy decision, right? Because the U.S. is like this. You got high achievement at the one end and much lower at the end. So if you want a system of excellence, but it has a cost. A system of equity now is using some of the research we've done, is trying to bring this bar up this way as we go through. That's where our challenges are. Because the hardest research is actually finding out what teachers can do differently than what we are. It's much harder to observe that directly. So that's a big part of the research I've been working on the last couple of years. All right. So I want to talk a bit about what we can measure through these tests. So we know we can measure academic achievement. That's not a problem. We can actually measure attitudes, at least what people tell us are their attitudes. We can measure perceptions. But of course, nowadays, what we're interested in measuring are things like integrity, right? Communication, critical thinking, creativity, maturity, empathy. Now, I bring those ones up in red because we actually did a study with medical students, people applying to be doctors, to go into medical school. So in North America, to go into medical school, you must first have 3 years of university, and then you apply separately to do that. And so it's a very competitive process. For example, at my university, there are 6,000 applicants each year. They narrow that down to 450, and then they narrow that down to 100. So that's every year, 100 students will get in out of approximately a pool of 6,000. So the final process used to be something called an interview, just a giant panel interview. And there's been some research out of McMaster University that said these don't work, and they've changed the model to use something called the multiple mini interview, where each applicant goes through a series of interviews, little small scenarios. And what they're actually trying to measure are these skills right up there: communication, empathy, critical thinking, problem solving. And they go through each station, and each station measures 1 or 2 of these traits. And at the end, they make decisions on who should get into medical school from the results of this MMI, as they call it. So our research, what we did is we looked at it and said, are we actually measuring these traits? And so we took all the data and we do something called factor analysis, and we break it down and we look at it and say, what are the traits coming out? And so we're trying to measure, in this case, there's actually 8 traits we were trying to measure, and there was across 8 stations, and they had multiple traits per observation, and we got a perfect result. We got 8 factors. We were happy, except for one small little detail. The factors we got were the 8 stations, not the traits. So every station seemed to create some sort of global response that students got measured on, or the applicants got measured on, not the traits. So we couldn't measure communication. Try as I might, I tried every kind of statistical. We don't cheat in statistics, but we definitely manipulate. So I tried everything to help the data get to where I wanted to. It didn't get there. It just, those 8 stations clearly came out. So what we've basically concluded is that these complex traits that we're trying to measure are actually very difficult to separate from each other. And they're very contextual. Each situation, each little mini interview actually controlled what we were measuring. In the end, we got a global measure that seemed to be readiness to become a doctor, or what we might call professionalism. But this idea that we're measuring independent traits couldn't get there. And I argue you actually can't therein. They're too complex and they're too interrelated to do that. Now, this is a really important study because this MMI, I don't know if it hasn't caught on here because of the structures, but police forces have been using it since then. I've been asked to consult on that and how they could use it to develop items on that. Medical schools, dental schools, nursing programs become a really dominant model of it because it seems to work globally. It just doesn't capture these things at a smaller level. Now, I bring this up because you may have heard of this term called 21st century learning skills. Yeah, and you're all smiling, you're going, oh no, right? But, they've been around for a while. I can show you documents from 1924 where we list the same skills largely. They've been there for quite some time. But there's a lot of demand. I've been asked several times to join committees to develop measures of resilience or grit. I tell people to watch the movie. But those kinds of things that we're trying to, I say we can't do that. You can't capture those things independently of each other. And I have a real issue with trying to use the measurement community to try to develop these things to push that agenda. I think they're important skills, but we have to be very careful as we attempt to measure them. So that's one thing I've really tried to push back on is this notion of trying to capture these specific little skills because they're very contextual and they're very challenging. All right. So I now want to talk a little bit about sort of the next area of research that I've gone into and done a lot of work in. And this one's been interesting because it really brings me back to where I started. And just to give you a sense, how do I explain this best to talk about this? When I started teaching, I was a person who thought testing took a lot of time and it wasn't worth doing. So I was looking for ways out of the testing regime. And I found a solution. I asked my students to develop the criteria to which they'd mark themselves on their assignments. I asked my students to write their own report cards. I asked my students to monitor their own learning based on outcomes. And I sat back and watched them do this. The parents loved me. They got lots of report cards, and I was enjoying teaching because I got to spend all my time teaching while they did all the assessment of their work. What I discovered since then was a whole science and research has been evolving around the whole areas of self-regulation that actually capture some of the things I stumbled upon quite by accident. I claim no research that drove me to do that to begin with. But it did lead me down this path where I am today. So what I want to talk about now is this whole idea of where we're coming from in today's classrooms, which I don't think are all that different from before. I was certainly trying to get students to be more self-engaged in learning. But the current school environment has really created what I would say are increasingly strained and complex teaching environments. It's harder to be a teacher because for many of us, the classrooms look different. Immigration is changing, integration of classes, integration of students. It's a different world in many ways. I don't think students have changed all that much, but definitely the interactions are changing. The accountability evolution is still there, both internal and external. I have real challenges with external accountability, and I've pushed back a lot of that in my research. But I do believe strongly in internal accountability, and that's that professional responsibility. But also this whole aspect of opportunity to learn. And I'll talk a bit about this at the end when I give another example of some of my research. But basically, we're asking students to get involved in very complex learning, yet they don't have equal access to the resources to get there. And also the whole knowledge, again, the self-regulated learning, the critical thinking, the grit. These are much more complex things than we used to talk about. So in doing that, we're asking students to be much more engaged in their self-regulated learning, to really monitor their learning. We want them to identify their strengths, their weaknesses. We want them to set short-term and long-term goals. I can honestly tell you that I've worked with teachers for many years. As teachers, we struggle with these things, and now we're trying to help our students with that. That's a challenge for us. And of course, we want our students doing this earlier. So this is where my path has really been kind of interesting, because as I told you, I've been very interested in a lot of large-scale testing, but I started with classroom assessment. That was my first real passion in trying to figure the game of classroom assessment. And my path through my research, even though it's done a lot of work in large scale, is also drifted back to classroom assessment and the power of classroom assessment and the challenges and opportunities within that. So it's a winding trail, but it's brought me back to where I started. And I want to finish up and show you a couple of examples of the work I've been doing in this field that sort of highlight these areas. So one of them, Alistair mentioned, I've been working with the Joint Committee for Students for Standards on Educational Evaluation, and we were asked to do a revision of something called the Classroom or Student Evaluation Standards. So the Joint Committee is best known for its work on program evaluation standards. It then produced the the student evaluation standards and also the personnel evaluation standards. I've worked on the last two. Our last revision, I was asked to chair the committee, and we spent 4 years developing a set of standards for teachers to use that would guide their instruction in terms of assessment. Now, what we purposely did in this, and for those of you that are in the field, we did not do what the APA did and go after what they call the test standards. We were trying to avoid that. But what we were trying to do is capture, especially in the US, their kind of structure for classroom assessment and some of the rules of the game that they were playing by, which I have to tell you, if you haven't seen it, is different. The education system in the US approaches teaching and assessment very different. They're much more into a diagnostic, always into that kind of monitoring approach. So we really have to try to watch our language around this. Now, the Joint Committee is a group of 14 educational organizations. So we're talking about AERA, American Education Research Association, APA, American Psychological Association, also has Canadian ones, CSSE, Canadian Evaluation Association, American Evaluation Association. So a lot of the biggest educational type groups. So they oversaw our work. So in 4 years, what we developed was a set of standards that really tried to show classroom assessment as something that is about supporting student learning. Now, we may all say this is obvious. It's not to the American educators. So what we've done is, in doing this, we've created a couple of, and this is where all the work took. The original student evaluation standards were 258 pages, somewhere around there. And we think the total readership was 8. We're not sure, but I think 10 books got read, but not everybody reads the books they buy. So, but they had a real problem selling them. So what we wanted to do is create a much smaller document that would be like a handbook that teachers would be able to use. So in doing that, we spent 4 years taking 37 standards that were there before, revising them, and then trying to make them much more user-friendly and to give some guidelines for teacher use. The result is a reduced amount of standards. We're basically down to 17 standards. And we tried to capture the breadth of things that we thought would cover formative assessment and classroom assessment. So, and we then organized them in a very different way. We started with what we call foundations, as you can see here, right? And these are kind of things that we talk about in terms of the basics of it. Again, my rock, the foundations. We then switched into something called use, and we tried to put a sort of an orderly system into how people would use these assessment standards, right, or use assessment in general. So right from the idea of starting with student performance, how do you analyze that, and then how do you give feedback and follow-up and things like that. So that's been a lot of the work in that area. Now, the interesting one in this one for me, even though we call it feedback, I do want to give a quick side story. I don't talk about feedback anymore. One of the things that we've discovered, and the reason we put its own separate section here, was feedback has largely been seen as one of the most effective ways of supporting learning. So from an assessment perspective, the better the feedback you give, the more effective the learning will be. The problem with feedback is it's very transmissive. It's very unidirectional. Even when we talk about others, it's very unidirectional. So some of my research with medical students has been more around a much more dialogic approach. And that is a dialogue between the student and the teacher, if you want, or between two students. And they started to call that feedback dialogues. The problem we still had was the term feedback still created that issue of directionality. So we started talking about learning dialogues. And what we did is we discovered, when we watched, in the case of the medical students, we had the student working with the attending, and it was much more of a dialogue. And you could actually see the attending learning as the student was as well. I then transferred this over to a grade 9 classroom, so for a year 10 classroom, math classroom. And we were watching two students talk about an assignment they did separately. They were doing feedback. But I was watching them, they started asking questions of each other. And all of a sudden, you could see both students think about what they had done a little differently. And so we talked about it being a learning dialogue, and that switched our language. We have kept it around feedback for now, but I'm going to argue from now on that this is actually a dialogue. It's a learning dialogue as opposed to a feedback or an assessment dialogue. All right, so that gets to reporting. And then lastly, of course, my passion is the whole issue around quality. How do we assure good quality of assessments? And what we decided to put right up front was the whole issue of diversity and exceptionality. This is, for the U.S., a big jump in that, so we thought it was critical to put it right up front. Where we got the most pushback, not from teachers, but from people in the associations, was we put reliability and validity together. Which, of course, anybody that's in the measurement field says, oh, you got to talk about those separately because they're such separate constructs. But the field doesn't talk that way, and we were trying to make this useful for teachers. So, and the last one we put in, we wanted to get into something called reflection, meta-analysis, you want to call it. But again, we were trying to use teacher-friendly terms. So the guidelines, the standards, I should say, have a sentence for each one, what it means, and then a set of guidelines to give guidance for that. Easy to use. And we've tried something different with them as well. We put them on Amazon to sell. And so we've actually used Amazon as a mechanism. Uptake's been better. It still needs some work. So we're working on how to do that. I tried to argue with the United States. I said each state just buy the rights to the book, and you could use it freely. But apparently they can't give up $500-600 to get the rights. So they're so controlled financially, so we've had to go a different way. Anyway, that's another story for another day, isn't it? So I do want to finish up with a couple of interesting new studies that I've been working on. And this is really around trying to find out ways to get teachers much more effective in classroom assessment. I'll say it right now for those of you in the room that believe in assessment literacy. I don't. I think we spend way too much time trying to find out if people are literate when we actually know they aren't. So I've been focusing on how to get them literate in the world of assessment. And that's been a lot of our research, creating models of professional learning that support assessment development in teaching. And what I've discovered is it actually works across contexts. So the one I'm going to finish up with is we've been working for the last 3 years in Tanzania, in rural Tanzania. And this was part of a funded project. So this is a school just at the morning assembly. And this is a grade or year 3 classroom. One of the smaller ones, this class had 96 students in it. So for year 3. And one of the things, and this is, just to give you a sample of another one, this is a year 1 classroom. It was actually one of the smaller year 1 classrooms. It only had 105 students in it. We did have one school that had 198 students in it, and I was told there was another one that had 240 in it. So I didn't get to that school. But basically, what we did in this study was we took a model, and I worked with African colleagues. This is not me coming to say how to do things. It was me working with my colleagues. And we looked for a way to help teachers develop some skills in assessment. So one of the things that's happening in Africa is every teacher must assess every student every day. So now do the math. That's a lot. So we were trying to show, well, there's different ways you can do assessment. It doesn't have to be formal. The classic model they were doing there was they'd ask a question, student give the answer, check. If they got it right, got it wrong, go to the next student. We said, well, let's change that. Get the students in small groups. Ask the question. Have the students work together. Teacher said, well, they can't do that. They'll be running all over the place. Well, he said, well, let's try it. Tried it. Students loved it. They got to talk to each other. Teacher walked around, only had 16, 20 tables to look at, as opposed to 140 students. And they all of a sudden said, you know, these things might help us to some extent. So we got into issues of questioning. And what we did, we used something called instructional rounds, where they actually watch each other teach. So over time, they'd watch each other. They'd give each other some feedback in terms of what was working. Other people call this lesson study. Depends on the context you're in. They didn't want to have it be evaluative, so we kept that out. And we also provided in between. We did a lot of work in between and giving some strategies for questioning, for writing multiple choice items, for writing different kinds of questions, different kinds of activities, feedback, some interesting stories on those. But throughout it, we got their stories of what they were learning. And that we then turned into a book called the Classroom Assessment Guidelines. And what I want to talk about here is what the book contains is literally stories that they got from our observations, and we modified them a little bit depending on the situation, and we captured the different examples of classroom assessment they were doing. Interestingly, almost every situation that came up was similar to contexts I had seen in the North American classrooms. Different kinds of challenges, but same questions, same difficulties with certain students, being off task, all the things that we see in our classroom, they were seeing as well. So the differences weren't as great as we thought. But clearly you can imagine, when you've got 120 students, by the way, no textbooks sometimes. Again, this is me, I'm a bit, even though my quantitative research was random, they were running out of desks. So the government brought in more desks. So I got there between 2 visits, and all of a sudden there's a giant pile of desks outside the building, right? They had no room for the desks. So they had them, but there's no room. So they had this beautiful wood. I love the wood. I like wood. So I wanted to take the wood home because it was so nice. Anyway, sorry. Sideline. All right. But here's it. So I have a picture on the side there because this is another part, the contextual part of all this. And that is, I had all these great photos of students learning. They said, we don't do that here. All of our textbooks and our books use cartoon-type drawings of what's happening in the classrooms. So what we did is we hired an artist to draw some of the things we talked about and saw, and he basically conceptualized it, and then that's throughout the book are these examples of the students working in these cartoons. And just recently, we were presenting at Kura, and my colleague, Washira, said, I think there's a whole paper on this whole idea of how do we contextualize these guidelines. And how do we talk about that process of doing that? Now, for me, I would have never thought of this. I'm a stats guy. All right, I wouldn't have thought, but I see the value of that, and it really fits into some of the things that I've learned since I've been here at the Waikato as well, this idea of the bicultural nature of the country and contextualized learning. I just have been woken up to it, so to speak. And for me, that is the pleasure of being a researcher, is every day there's an opportunity to move forward and think differently about the things you've done. And it can be a little thing. It can be a comment that was made in this case about one of the questions in the audience came about, have you thought about talking about that? And that's what I think is so great about being an academic researcher, being an educational researcher. And so for that, even today, I stand in front of you looking out into what I call a fog. But if you look closely, even through that fog, there's bits of light, bits of land forming new ideas that are starting to form. And that's what I have to thank for my colleagues, the students I work with, the research I've been honored to be part of, and I will continue to do that. And I hope you will do that as well through your journey, and I hope we'll have the chance to work together on many of these things. So with that, I do want to say thank you for being here today. I do want to have a special thank you. I can't even see her. My daughter is here from Canada somewhere. There she is. So, yeah. So thank you so much for being here. And I see my 35 minutes is bang on. So I got lucky on that. You see, that's the measuring guy. That matters, right? So thank you so much.